Hello, and welcome back to the third and final video in the series. In the last video, we discussed the absolute existence of the past. This broadening of the real to include the virtual, the entirety of the past, or what Bergson calls pure memory, is incredibly exciting to me in relation to spiritual and occult ideas. At its most fundamental level, it gives us a new, dynamic way to think beyond materialism, which I will argue that spiritual and occult thought is surprisingly in need of. More specifically, it has led me to rethink ideas of necromancy, or communication with the dead, the presence of the dead in general, reincarnation, telepathy, or the interconnectedness of consciousness, and the possibility of consciousness beyond the body. The next part of this video we'll look at how the absolute reality of time in its real but virtual status relates to these topics. But first we'll explore the need to move past materialism, even if we thought we had already left it. If there are any spiritually or occult-oriented people listening, you're probably thinking, what is he talking about? I believe in spirits, demons, and an immaterial soul, an existence of meaning beyond the human mind. I am not a materialist. I've already moved past this. Or maybe you're an idealist and you think that all there is mind. Yet in both cases, I would still say that materialism reigns strong in your habits of thought. Bergson points out that we have evolved to survive, and so the negotiation of matter has been of the greatest importance. A hard delineated understanding of objects is key in our ability to survive from day to day. Thus our language, logic, and general view of the world has been modeled off solids, as this is the most useful to our survival. This default status of our being means that we cannot simply move past materialism, but rather it is something we must constantly negotiate. For example, even though we just explored the non-spatial reality of duration, when we think about our day, we cannot help but organize these events along a timeline, as if they were separate, impenetrable objects distributed in space. This is because it is incredibly useful to do so. If we want to know duration intimately, we must constantly remind ourselves to resist these spatialized habits so that we can experience a movement of thought that does not conform to our spatial logic and enter into intuitive thought, as we discussed earlier. Many occultists and spiritualists posit levels of reality, different worlds, and spiritual entities. They would probably say these things exist beyond the material. Yet just like our irresistible tendency to spatialize time, we will often find that we have unconsciously resorted to spatial logic in dealing with what is supposed to be non-spatial. We might resort to thinking of the soul as located somewhere in the body, or we may think of the so-called higher planes of reality as mere reiterations of our material world. We might think of spirits as having hard, distinct outlines, as if they were material objects. Does a thought have a distinct border? Or does it exist as a fluctuating intensity that is fused and mixed into the continuity of things? Maybe spirits exist more so in this way. My point is that this spatialization of the spiritual contradicts the very essence of what we initially formulated to be, non-spatial. If we don't constantly remind ourselves of our tendency to think in terms of space, we will lose touch with the spiritual by unknowingly reducing our thoughts and experiences around it into spatial terms, just as we do with time when we reflect on our day. To enter into the intimate realm of thought that touches the spiritual, we must constantly negotiate this tendency. Thinking about the spiritual, or even just thought itself, when it is not confused with representation of thought, is a spiritual practice. Now let's discuss how the virtual existence of the entire past as pure memory relates to the dead. Since memory is usually understood as being stored in the brain, we are generally inclined to think of memory as being a personal phenomena. This results in two assumptions. One, that we can only remember our personal past, and two, that when we die, our memories no longer exist. Yet, as we just discussed, Bergson does not believe the past is stored anywhere. Rather, it automatically persists virtually in all of its detail. This is pure memory, and the act of remembering, at its most fundamental level, is the past becoming useful in the present. There's nothing about this process that is inherently confined to the individual subject. In Bergson's model, the memories that we call our own are not in us, and in a sense do not belong solely to us, as they are part of the objective past that has its own existence. What we refer to as our personal memory is actually defined by what is most useful to us. As my body is a center of action, what is useful to me pertains to my specific body. The history of my body thus becomes the most relevant portion of the past in regards to my present state. This is why memories seem to belong to me. You can remember what you did yesterday, and I cannot remember what you did yesterday, as it is far more relevant to your present than it is to mine. Relevance hierarchies modulate the past's ability to become part of our present. On one level, this explains why we must withdraw from the present to recall something more arbitrary. We may close our eyes so that our surroundings do not overpower the less useful past in their imminent relevance. It explains why memory seems to be isolated to the individual subject, but in principle is part of the objective past. If we entertain Bergson's theory of pure memory here, we can see that the assumptions around memory as purely personal and something that dies with the body are no longer so obvious. Imagine, all experiences, all past images, all events exist in some way. The world becomes infinitely larger. This expansion of the real gives us room to take seriously occult phenomena that is usually rejected on the basis of its incompatibility with materialism. How might we look at occult practices such as communication with the dead or necromancy in relation to this worldview? Many people might roll their eyes at the consideration of this, yet if the past persists and is non-local and non-individual, communication with the dead no longer seems so far out, so implausible. Perhaps you are already contacting the dead without being aware of it. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake points out that it seems as though children inherit attributes, skills, or information from their parents that was acquired or developed over the course of their parents' life. In other words, Sheldrake believes that the life experience of the parent has an effect on their children's nature. He does not believe that this influence can be reduced to the social influence the parent has on their child, as he observes that acquired skill seems to be inherited even when the child has no contact with their parent. It must also be pointed out that this could not be explained by our current materialist understanding of inheritance that sees attributes of the parent being passed to the children through DNA, as we cannot alter our DNA through our lifetime. How might this information be passed on? Sheldrake, who was heavily influenced by Bergson, develops the hypothesis of morphic resonance to account for this apparent phenomena. Morphic resonance is predicated on the idea that the past persists non-materially, or in Sheldrake's words, as a field of memory. Our body, which is a center of action, actualizes memory into actions based on its relevance or usefulness. Again, the portion of the past that I call my personal past is most relevant to my action, and my recent past is still more relevant. Thus, I can remember it most clearly. In that my biology resembles my parents' biology, their past becomes relevant, as there is a structural similarity between the two centers of action. Maybe a father moved to Japan after having a child in America, Later in life, the child may try to make contact with his father by traveling to Japan. Upon arriving in a small town, the child finds the streets familiar and is able to navigate them in ways a normal newcomer could not, as something of his father's experience is retained in his present. These types of events, which are reported all the time, can be understood through the idea of morphic resonance. The way I see morphic resonance is essentially an attempt to build a testable science from Bergson's metaphysics. Sheldrake has done some interesting research that seems to suggest the non-physicality of memory and is worth checking out. So if our relationship with the past extends beyond the normal conception of a personal past, it is not inconceivable that we are influenced by our dead ancestors, those who came before us. Their memories become present in our actions. These distant memories would need to become ambiguous enough to insert themselves into our present as useful to our action. This would mean that someone's experience of, say, encountering a poisonous snake by a specific rock in a specific meadow and being bit would be useful to us as a generalized fear of snakes. The specific context would not apply to ours, as we might be in a desert. Thus, we recall the broader past through feelings, as they are what emerge as useful. This would be a non-material model of instinct, and would see instinct as an ancestral contact through a dynamic temporal transformation. This is admittedly quite a tame conception of communication with the dead, and hardly rings the tone of the more occult image of a necromancer. A large part of spiritual and magical traditions all over the world is the practice of trying to explicitly and intentionally make contact with the dead. This is sometimes referred to as necromancy. In this piece, I use the term necromancy in the most broad sense as an intentional contact or communication with the dead. This is not limited to contact for divination, but also entails contact for whatever reason. This form of practice goes beyond remembering our ancestors' experiences by the means of a general fear of snakes, and instead claims specific contact with the dead and even named individuals. Yet, is it not the case that these two phenomena could be of the same process, but at different resolutions of generality? As we recall, Bergson proposes that the past's ability to become present, or as we might say, recalled, is modulated by its usefulness to our action. He states that the more we remove ourselves from the demands of the present, the more we can enter into the past. Is it possible that necromancers and communicators with the dead have developed the ability to free themselves from the regulatory constraints of the present and are able to access the past at more and more specific levels, to the point where they can obtain specific details of past lives? Remember, in Bergson's model, the past is all there in all of its detail. It is as real as space. There are two aspects of necromancy that are very much in accord with our Bergsonian approach. This approach can give us insight into why the use of trance states, dreams, and entheogens are common practice in necromancy, and also why messages from the dead are often presented in strange and obscure symbology. Many magical practitioners and spiritualists claim that altered states, as just mentioned, help them access the spirit world. Yet I have heard little of how or why they do. If we take a Bergsonian approach, we might equate the spirit world with the virtuality of the past. As we have discussed, our access to this horizon is heavily regulated and constrained by the demands of the present. The use of things like entheogens would then be an effort to interrupt the regular flow of the past into our action. What is normally useful is no longer useful, as our center of action is in a physically altered state. This could be a theory for how substances actually alter our conscious states, as our apparatus for action would alter our access to the past and thus our experience itself, as experience is a temporal synthesis. But for the point of this video, entheogens are precisely useful in necromancy because they interrupt our normal resonance with the past, thus allowing for different aspects of the past to actualize in our present experience. We can see how sleep alleviates us from the demands of the present as well, as we close our senses and arrest our ability to act. Some necromancers might stare into reflective surfaces or smoke in an effort to commune with the past. Again, we can see how this glazed, relaxed, unfocused staring is in fact an attempt to release oneself from the demands of the present so that the past is no longer constrained. We do not need to go to the spirit world. It is already here in its virtuality. We access it by a negative effort of navigating what limits it, the present call to action. The other interesting aspect of necromancy that harmonizes with our Bergsonian take is that the received messages from the dead often appear in strange symbolic and non-literal arrangements. Skeptics will usually fixate on this. They might say something like, if you're really communicating with the dead, why wouldn't they just tell you what you wanted to know in a direct and clear way? The usual argument, then, is that the symbols arise from the unconscious, and because symbols are ambiguous, the necromancer is able to project meaning into them and delude themselves into thinking that they are speaking with a dead ancestor. Now, I believe that this is in fact sometimes the case, but I can also see that if communication with the dead is possible, it makes sense that it would appear in obscure and symbolic ways. There are two main reasons. The first is that we must remember that the virtual is not a mere reiteration of the actual, but is different in kind. Remember our living experience of a song? The notes resonate virtually with our present, creating a qualitative thickness that is the experience of melody. But if we recall, the point of analyzing this experience was to show that we cannot treat this reality as if it were space. The past notes of the song exist virtually and do not exist as discrete units, but rather flow into each other, mixing at every stretch in a continuous flux of difference. This is the status of the past, or the virtual, if you will. So if we can access memories that are not our own, it makes sense that they would appear in obscure ways, as they wouldn't have the lattice of context that is our personal life to carve out their boundaries. The other point is that the symbol is more likely to enter our present as it has more relevance potential in its multitude of meaning. Just as the memories of dangerous snakes become useful to us as they generalize into a feeling of fear, specific memories of the dead may generalize into a symbolic image in a process that makes the specific memory more relevant to the present, thus allowing us to recall it. So we've laid out an account of how communication with the dead might be possible in regards to the doctrine of pure memory. But this conversation has been largely one-sided. We have mainly focused on the experience of the necromancer and their reception of the dead, and have said little about the subjective status of the dead themselves. Is the necromancer communicating with another consciousness, or are they merely accessing information beyond their personal life? From what I can understand, the practice of speaking with the dead is built on the idea that one is actually entering into a dialogue, that there is a real contact with another form of consciousness. How might we think about this? I admittedly have veered quite a distance from Bergson in the subject matter of this video, but I will follow his lead and take a radically non-spatial and dynamic approach to this question. As I addressed earlier, Bergson shows us a way to think outside the constraints of spatialized thought that grip us so tightly. Here's my dynamic approach. If we are going to talk about communication between subjects, we must first define what we think a subject is. Our spatial habits of thought condition us to think of subjectivity as a spatial phenomena. It feels as though our consciousness is located behind our facial features somewhere in our head. Yet this belief runs into a number of issues, as it materializes consciousness in the very notion of localization. If we believe that consciousness exists in a place, we are determined to understand it as arising from matter, as we have attributed physical properties to it by the very act of locating it. We will quickly find ourselves faced with the impenetrable hard problem of consciousness if we take this approach. And even if we ignore this problem and posit that somehow there is a smaller subjective you that emerges behind your sense organs peering out of them, we merely push the problem back and slip into an infinite regress for how is this subjectivity able to perceive the world. Bergson avoids this hard problem of consciousness by seeing the distinction between subject and object as one that is temporal rather than spatial. For me, this is one of the most profound statements I've pondered in my philosophical pursuits. Yet it took me a while to understand, and is something I continually practice to think. If thought is a movement, it is not something we obtain and move on. It is something we can practice for the sake of the movement itself. It is something we need to merge with and resist the urge to solidify it by means of static concepts and compartmentalizations. Considering this, I will now try to break down what Bergson's temporal distinction between subject and object is as best I can, given the time constraints of this increasingly long video topic. Let's look at the statement one more time, exactly as Bergson puts it in Matter and Memory. Quote, "Questions relating to subject and object, to their distinction and their union, should be put in terms of time rather than space." Unquote. To think of our consciousness or subjectivity as being located behind our sense organs would be to think of it in spatial terms. A common approach to the subject-object distinction goes something like this. There is a world out there, and our internal representation of it within. Matter and the image of matter. Bergson's move, as I discuss at length in my video on images, is to see the image as belonging to matter, making our perception of the image not in fact a perception of anything, but rather the pre-existing image in itself. This is a new division to the subject-object divide, for normally we understand the perceptual image as belonging to the subjective realm and think of it as a product of consciousness, but here Bergson has assigned the image to objective reality. This means that rather than consciousness producing a perceptual image, pre-existing images constitute what we call our perception. Our perception is in the world, not in us. We can see that our usual internal-external divide will no longer be sufficient in this model, because what we usually think of as inside us is actually in the world. So how is it that we feel separate from our object of perception? We must see it as a temporal distinction. The way I see it is that a portion of the past in general becomes useful in the present, as it influences the selection of one of the many responses that a body presents. The past's relationship to a body gets more and more defined, more and more specific, as a body develops various motor mechanisms. This reciprocal process defines a specific resonance of the past to a specific body, and it is through this specific resonance that a portion of the past comes to identify with a body in the perpetual generation of the individual subject. That portion of the past is what we come to call our specific past, and thus our experience. Try to think about this dynamically. The subject is not prefigured. It is not given a priori. It is something that is being perpetually defined and generated, a continuous reincarnation of the past into the present. This is quite clearly seen in the evolution of a human life, as a sense of self gets more and more defined as we move from infancy to adulthood, or as the past becomes more and more defined in relation to a specific center of action, a human body. This formulation of the self, or the individual subject, opens up many questions and possibilities for occult systems that include spirit consciousness. Many occult doctrines see the individual self as an illusion and something to strive and eliminate, while others, quite contrarily, see the individual as an absolute component of existence. How does our understanding of individual subjectivity fit into this binary? It seems to me that our position is situated more or less in between these two extremes. A body is embedded in the totality of images, and is itself composed of images. Yet, it returns movements in ways that are not prefigured in the past. The past becomes specific to a certain body as the body acts into the world. Through this relationship, the past comes to feel the body as its own, and the body comes to use that portion of the past as its own. This is the ongoing genesis of the individual subject. In this view, we cannot deny a certain level of individuality, since this specific relationship of the past and the present is real. Yet we can see how the individual is not so absolute, as what we call our past, the thing that really defines us, is not within us, not solely confined to us, as our past belongs to and is part of the entirety of the past. We only come to see it as ours through a simultaneous co-defining relationship, which is the genesis of individual subjectivity itself. It is no surprise that the thinker of pure multiplicity could lead us to a formulation of the self that is both one and many. Returning to our initial question, we may ask, how does this dynamic formulation of the subject relate to the topic of necromancy? As we considered subjectivity to be a temporal phenomena, we can no longer distinguish the necromancer and the dead as if they were objects in space. The question, is there an experience on the other end of the necromancer, begins to lose meaning as subjective experience is experienced, not located. The communication between two subjectivities becomes quite confused, as the distinction is one that is no longer a clean spatial distinction, just as the notes of a song are different but not separate in our experience of music, as they bleed into each other without being reduced to homogeneity. Might our idea of separate subjectivities follow this cue? We must consider the idea that subjectivities could interpenetrate without collapsing into a unity. Maybe it is possible that that specific portion of the past becomes conscious through the necromancer's openness to it. We would then have an oscillation between subjectivities, each transforming into one another in a multi-subjective process of communication. This is not a resort to an it's all in your head interpretation, as our conception of self has no interior. There can be true alterity, true difference. This may seem paradoxical to our spatially wired minds, the idea of subjectivities being fused but also distinct. But we must remember that paradox is made possible by our spatial understanding. In space, an object can only be what it is. For instance, a circle cannot also be a square. But when we enter a dream and are freed from the regulatory function of spatial necessity, we can often experience a person being two people at once, separate and unified, without the faintest feeling of paradox. It only becomes paradoxical when we awake and reflect on it with our spatial understanding. We must constantly remind ourselves of this when we get tangled and constricted by our spatial tendencies. If you're having trouble with my formulation of necromancy, try again, but don't grip so hard, for gripping condenses thought into objects, and objects distort our ability to access the multiplicitous, the non-spatial, the virtual. We must include feeling into our thoughts. We must think intuitively. This is where Bergson has led me, not to a conclusion, but to a way of thinking dynamically, to a way of approaching thought that sees the formulation of questions as the core of thought itself. My account of the genesis of the subject is probably somewhat messy, not completely sound, yet it has opened the possibility for me to think about things that have fascinated me for a long time in new ways. It has immanentized the elusive occult worlds and made them a part of my life, a part of time. Not somewhere else, but in the very essence of duration and becoming. So I've explored the idea that a prior temporal synthesis of the past into the present is what makes the individual subject possible. And if we take this as the conditions for the subject, we may be able to conceive of how different subjectivities could arise through different resonances with the past. My focus was mainly on how this might affect our understanding of communication with the dead, or necromancy as I refer to it. But we can already begin to see how this is entangled with other occult horizons, such as reincarnation, life after death, and disembodied spirits. Our approach to the subject and to necromancy saw the past as something that is incarnating into the present, passing from virtual into actual, producing the tone of experience. We might begin to see how we could approach reincarnation as a temporal transformation rather than a spatial transposition. Our life, as we explored it, could be seen as a perpetual reincarnation of the past into the present in a process that refined the past's relationship to the body, solidifying a portion of the past into what gives us the sense of interiority. In this process, the body seems to be the differentiator, or the thing that unifies our experience as it patterns the past through its action potentials. If we accept the doctrine of pure memory, what happens to the experience that make up a life when the body returns to Earth? Do they dissipate into oblivion, or might they retain some sort of structure through their internal relevance? Might these structures of past lives influence the present and, in a sense, incarnate into it through a continuous process? These are the questions I'm led to, but in an attempt to keep this already exceedingly long video to a reasonable length, I must leave it there. If you made it this far, I'm very impressed. This was a long, tedious, and far-out one, but I'm glad I put it out there and I had fun doing it. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and I hope you enjoyed the video.